Hi, all. Welcome to week 4. Today we're going to talk about native peoples of the Arctic. I'm going to go through most of the chapter, the kind of general concepts, and then I'm going to have you kind of look at the case studies on your own, and we'll talk. I'll talk about what I really want you to focus on when reading those two case studies at the end of the chapter on the Inuit and the Aleuts. All right, so in terms of people and language group, um, Arctic peoples today are very different biologically than people living from further south. We also need to understand that there have been several migrations over the last 20,000 years or so. And these groups of people that we're going to talk about today are fairly new. So, biologically, very different. They're going to tend to look more in terms of a physical, observable facial structure, body structure. They're going to have stockier bodies, and they maintain the epicanthic folds in their eyes, similar to a lot of the Eastern Asian and Northern Asian population. Eskimo, we talk about naming and naming people. Eskimo is a derogatory term given by the Arctic or given to Arctic peoples by the Algonquian, which are further south, as raw meat eaters. This is a derogatory term to almost associate with less civilized. Now, the tough part here is for us, we're talking about English. This may have been a term that the Algonquians used to bond with European colonial groups, or it could have just been something that they, felt and distinguished themselves between the northern group or whatnot. Now, a lot of times we take this as um, a very kind of mean term. They may have just called them raw meat eaters, and it's just like talking to your friend who eats sushi, who is a raw meat eater. It might not have been as derogatory as we thought it was. It may just be that we put our bias on that. Again, these colonial contact periods are really, really hard to understand whether or not the true makeup or treatment or relationship is being portrayed here, and whether or not contact had a role in that. The group breakups look like this. Uh, the Unangan peoples, or the Aleuts of the Aleutian Islands, are going to be, if you look at this map on the PowerPoint, kind of that island group that is in that blue-gray kind of around the west coast of Alaska, down in the southern region. They're going to be in that region of the Arctic. Now, what's different about this group is they're not necessarily, it's not frozen all the time, and is actually considered a warmer area of the Arctic. However, they're placed in this group because they are related kind of linguistically, and they are newer to the land. The Inuit people are going to be all the way over. If you look at Greenland, it's that solid, giant white island up there. And the Inuit people are going to be in that, again, blue, gray, green kind of coastal region of Greenland. The Yupik people are going to be central Alaska, more central Alaska, and southern, so closely related to the Aleuts. And then the Inupiaq are going to be northern Alaska. Um, they break the language group into Eskimo Aleut, and the Eskimo include three branches, which are these other three groups: the Yupik, Inuit, and Surinsky, which are the people of Siberia. Geography and environment. Obviously, we're talking about the Arctic. Everybody should have in their mind frozen area. However, this is starting to change. We're starting to get what was once looked for, which is called the Northwest Passage, in terms of water not freezing over in the Arctic uh, during the wintertime. Um, Very cold climate, large bodies of water, icy terrain, very little vegetation. So when we talk about foodstuffs and what people are eating and using for material culture, uh, vegetation, plant life, those kinds of things are not really included. We're really going to be focusing on animal uh, protein, vitamins, sources of nutrition through animal meat. Very low levels of radiation. So again, the ice is going to reflect a lot of that radiation up north. This also may be why the native groups up north maintain some of that dark pigment in their skin. Usually we see people further from the equator being lighter skinned. It may be that this reflection is also getting rid of a lot of that, um, a lot of the radiation is being reflected by the ice, and ultimately it's not affecting the people in terms of too much vitamin D or those kinds of things. So also it could be part of their diet. So typically we see lighter skinned people away from the equator because diet has also changed and the need for vitamin D exists. Little precipitation, again, up in the northern regions. We call this the polar desert because it's less than that 11 inches of precipitation, and is kind of considered a desert. Tundra is going to be below that, and a lot of times it's frozen, but it thaws out in the summer. And again, we're not talking about much vegetation in any of this area. Up in the polar desert and tundra, there's what's called the permafrost, which is the subsoil that is frozen all year long, which is going to play into human burial, as we'll discover through this chapter. The animals that were utilized and that occupy this area are caribou. Caribou play an important role in terms of skins and meat protein. Muskox as well, same kind of deal. Grizzly bears, polar bears, black bears, wolves, wolverines, lynx. There's Arctic foxes, rabbits, and other rodents. These are all going to be part of that food and utilization of nature in this animal realm. Dogs were super important to this group of people, not only for traveling. Many times dogs are thought to be sled carriers. They carry the people. Most of the time, this is dramatized in a Western fashion, and dogs were used to pull sleds, but they were to carry materials, not necessarily people. Dogs are also used for the hunt, and we'll talk about them as well. Remember, dogs have probably been domesticated anywhere between 40,000 and 20,000 years ago. So the longest domestication, that date keeps getting pushed back as well. Sea animals, birds and eggs were also a very important source of food. And seals made up a large part of the people's diet. So when we talk about sea animals, we also need to talk about the mammals like seals, otters, and some of those other mammal life that were used not only for their skins, the blubber, oil for lighting and heating, and then also food, meat consumption. Research, ethnographic research, and history. Again, ethnographic, I'll start with ethnographic research in terms of, we kind of covered this with Boaz a bit. These are some other names if you guys want to research these guys. Rasmussen, very important because I believe that he had Inuit blood or Arctic native blood in him. So he kind of went back and studied his own group. We would call this native anthropology, very, very important. Loses more of its bias. So the mid 1900s, Boaz was up there earlier than that, probably late 20s or 20s through the 40s. Really focused on technology and environment. How are these people surviving and adapting? And currently, anthropologists are up there studying and doing ethnographies, but they're really looking at acculturation and possibly even the return to traditional ideas. There's been a lot of health issues as of late as Arctic people start to adapt to or attempt to adapt to a Western diet. This has caused a lot of problems, and we'll talk about that kind of further in the lecture. So going back to the history, kind of working our way back. The land bridge brings a lot of people from 14,000 years ago. Again, we keep pushing this date back, and it may even have been further back as sea levels have risen. Anthropologists and archaeologists are starting to believe that there was this corridor that they call the Kelp Road, and people followed it on the coast, so have gotten down sooner. However, the people that are in the Arctic now and have been there for a while, they came over on land, obviously, and pretty much butted up against people that had already existed. So a lot of when you think of migration, think of people kind of traveling, working their way down, and then occupying that space all the way up. So that's why we say that the Arctic peoples that are there now are probably the most recent people to be there. They're not people who have occupied that space for a very, very long period of time. And although there may be diffusion and relation blood-wise and mixing and those kinds of things, this group looks predominantly newer in terms of language and blood. Um, Paleoarctic, we start to get into kind of that older time period of how older the older groups of people that were there 10,000 years ago. And again, these people seem to have moved, and a lot of them moved south into less, we could say, less harsh environmental conditions. Um, Arctic people that are there now began moving east 1,000 years ago, replacing the people that have been there before. And this really goes into that kind of contact period with the Norse, um, that the Inuit may have showed up when Eric the Red was kind of Iceland, Greenland area, and no people were there. This may have been the in between spot where the ancient people that occupied that space had left, and new people hadn't arrived yet. We have Norse contact 1,000 years ago. Leif Erikson up in Greenland, and then down into Newfoundland, right? Russia lands in 1732. Alaska, they forced the Aleuts into hunting sea otters, almost to extinction. This forced a lot of conflict. At this time, the Unangan or Aleuts teamed together. There for a while, they had kind of maybe some conflict here and there, some war parties, those kind of things. But they form an alliance to fight against the Russians, and actually do a decent job of hanging on to their culture and become very fierce warriors in this way. American whalers, introduce venereal diseases, rum, and deplete natural resources. This is kind of obviously up the east coast of the United States and into kind of the Arctic area there, but also on the American side of Alaska when we start to, after we've purchased the land from Russia. And this causes major problems in terms of venereal diseases, rum dependency, alcohol dependency. And because the Arctic peoples were so spread out, this is an interesting fact. In general, they were not as affected by things like smallpox as lower groups of native peoples. However, there are groups that were definitely decimated by smallpox. I mean, so those groups that were maybe more compact in terms of population had bigger problems. If you were less spread out, if you were more spread out, I mean, throughout the Arctic, and most likely you're not going to come into contact with these groups of people. It's pretty kind of interesting to think about. Remember, obviously, people with these viral diseases and whatnot had to be sick themselves. So to travel over a frozen landmass to affect a bunch of little groups doesn't really make sense. They're going to come up as whalers, right? And be in port cities. That's going to then affect contact around these kind of, I would say, coastal areas more than anywhere else. But again, kind of think about spacing and how disease works, right? And it basically has to be contact to contact. So actually, the Arctic peoples in general fared much better in this area than a lot of the native groups. So political and social organization, this is an interesting one. Remember, when I talk about band level groups being egalitarian for the most part, we get 20 to 30 to 300 people, small family groups. You tend to not have status. Now there were groups like the Unagans that you'll kind of discover when you read about the case study. They had headmen of the family groups, so the men tended to have more status. Those individuals tended to have more status within the village and then make decisions. Tended to be more patrilineal or patrilocal. Now remember, here's the issue with the idea of egalitarian leadership in groups. If you have a more patrilineal or patrilocal, which means you follow the father's bloodline and you live where the father or the husband's family lives, there tended to be a hierarchy of status. Many of these band level groups were matrilineal or matrilocal, which tended to be women side of bloodline. But what's interesting here is that men tended to have status associated with patrilineal, but women had equal status with matrilineal. So what we see is when women are kind of empowered with bloodline, they tend to not hold power, they tend to share power. So this is an interesting kind of commentary on groups like